I knew something was off when no one looked me in the eye that morning. Usually, Kevin from accounting would crack a joke about how I hadn't aged a day. Dana might have left a sticky note on my monitor. "Don't work too hard, birthday boy." But that morning, it was just quiet. Too quiet for a Tuesday. Too still for a team that prided itself on passive-aggressive banter and stale breakroom donuts. I sat at my desk, fingers wrapped around a chipped mug of coffee that had gone cold half an hour earlier. My inbox was clean. My to-do list was ready. I'd shown up like I had every day for 11 years. Early, steady, prepared. And yet, something had shifted. At 9:12, my phone buzzed. "Hey Jason, mind stepping into the main conference room for a sec?" No signature. Just Derek. The boss's son. Fresh out of business school and 2 months into his shiny new role as director of operations. A title that meant nothing and everything, depending on who was asking. I stood slowly. Straightened my collar. Walked past 3 co-workers who barely nodded. That hallway had never felt so long. When I opened the door, Derek was already sitting at the head of the table, legs crossed, grinning like he was about to show off a new startup idea. "Jason," he said. "Happy birthday, man. Big day." I gave a slow nod. "Thanks." He slid a manila folder across the table. "I've got a surprise for you." I didn't move. Something in my chest tightened. He kept smiling. "We've been reevaluating departmental efficiencies, streamlining some legacy roles, making space for new growth." I looked down at the folder. Inside, a release form, 2-week severance, and a neutral-sounding memo that felt like it had been written days ago. "This is my termination?" I asked. He shrugged. "We prefer to call it a strategic transition." I blinked. Once. Twice. "You're firing me? On my birthday?" His grin faltered for half a second. I thought about waiting, but legal said it's best not to delay. Clean cut, you know. Clean cut. I sat there, letting the words settle like dust. 11 years. No warning. No conversation. No thanks. He started saying something about next steps, references, a possible consulting project down the line. I wasn't listening anymore. I was watching the cheap ceiling lights flicker above him. Listening to the hum of the AC unit that always ran too cold. Something inside me curled up in shame. And then, just beneath it, something else stirred. Something sharper. Quieter. Not rage. Not yet. Just a quiet sense of no. A sense that this moment would not define the story. I stood up. Collected the folder. He reached out for a handshake. I didn't take it. Instead I said, "You'll regret this." It wasn't a threat. Just a fact that hadn't unfolded yet. I walked out of that room not knowing what came next. Only that whatever it was, I'd face it with my back straight. When I got back to my desk, a single cupcake sat on my keyboard. Chocolate, slightly smashed, with a candle that had burned halfway down. No note. No card. Just a quiet reminder that someone, somewhere, still saw me. I didn't eat it. Instead, I packed my things slowly. I left behind the framed team photo from 2017, the mugs, the motivational calendar. All of it could stay. It didn't belong to me anymore. The elevator ride down was silent. In the lobby, the security guard gave me a nod, hesitant, unsure if he should say something. I gave him a small smile and walked out into the bright morning, box in hand, the air oddly warm for February. Outside, life carried on. Buses hissed. Phones rang. A delivery truck pulled into the loading bay I used to oversee. That was the hardest part, knowing that things would go on without me. That the world didn't stop just because mine had shifted. I drove home without turning on the radio. The roads blurred a little, not from tears exactly, just from something heavy pressing behind my eyes. My phone buzzed once. Then again. Birthday texts from people who didn't know yet. People who still thought I was celebrating. At a red light, I looked at my hands on the steering wheel. They weren't shaking. They weren't clenched. Just steady. That surprised me. When I pulled into my driveway, the porch light was still on. My son's skateboard leaned against the step. My wife's keys dangled in the lock. The world was still mine. Smaller now, but intact. I sat in the car for a long time before going inside. I wasn't ready to explain it yet. But I knew, in a way I hadn't before, that this wasn't the end. It was just the last page of one chapter. And I had no intention of leaving the next one blank. I didn't turn the radio on. The silence felt like the only thing I could handle. My hands stayed steady on the wheel, muscle memory taking me home, but my head was somewhere else entirely, looping back to that office, that moment, that voice saying my role had run its course. I wasn't angry. Not yet. What I felt was worse. Emptiness. Like I'd been hollowed out from the inside and left to keep walking around in the shell of someone useful. At a red light, I watched a delivery guy speed past on a scooter. He looked free. I felt tethered, bound by everything I'd worked for, now gone in one 14-minute meeting. The house looked normal when I pulled up. Kids' bikes tossed on the lawn. A neighbor mowing his lawn, nodding like nothing in the world had shifted. I sat in the car for 20 minutes, just watching. The longer I waited, the harder it became to move. I stared at the house like it belonged to someone else. The porch light flickered on even though the sun was still out. I wanted to cry, but I didn't. Eventually, I walked in. Shoes off, jacket hung like it was any other Thursday. I told myself, just get through today. My wife was in the kitchen, humming something soft while stirring pasta. The smell was familiar, grounding. She turned, smiled. "You're home early." I smiled back. Yeah, traffic was light. Lie number 1. My son ran in before I could say anything else, holding a handmade card with glitter smudged on the edges. He shoved it into my hands with pride. "Happy promotion day, Daddy." The words felt like a punch. I looked at my wife, who was grinning behind him, clearly in on the surprise. She whispered, "We believed in you." My son pulled me toward the dining table where a small chocolate cake sat, candles already lit. He counted loudly. 3, 2, 1. I blew them out. Managed a smile. Said thank you. Kissed their heads. Ate the cake. But every bite tasted like failure. After dinner, while my wife was putting our son to bed, I stood by the kitchen sink, rinsing my plate longer than I needed to. I stared at the water running down the drain, my thoughts louder than ever. How did I not see it coming? The cutbacks. The new hire last quarter. The way my boss had started calling me, buddy, again. I missed the signs, all of them. Because I trusted too much. Because I kept my head down and assumed hard work was enough. "Everything okay?" she asked, walking in quietly. I nodded. Just tired. Lie number 2. Later, lying next to her in bed, I couldn't sleep. Her breathing was soft, rhythmic. She had no idea. And I couldn't bring myself to tell her. Not tonight. Not when she looked so proud, like she had married a man worth believing in. I stared at the ceiling, counting the seconds between each tick of the wall clock. I wasn't just grieving the job. I was grieving the man I thought I was becoming. The provider. The builder. The guy with a plan. And underneath the grief, something sharp started to take shape. A question. Not shouted. Not panicked. Just persistent. How did I let this happen to me? I'd given years to that company. Missed birthdays, worked holidays, stayed silent when credit was stolen. All for what? A badge of loyalty that dissolved the second the numbers didn't add up in their spreadsheets? I wasn't angry at them. Not yet. I was angry at myself, for thinking I was immune. Somewhere around 3 a.m., I got up, walked to the living room, and sat in the dark. No phone. No distractions. Just the weight of it all pressing down. Maybe it wasn't just the company that failed me. Maybe I had failed to see my own value beyond their approval. Maybe I'd handed over the pen, let them write my worth in quarterly reviews and polite feedback emails. I didn't know what came next. But I knew this. I couldn't go back to who I was. Not because I didn't want to. Because I couldn't unknow this feeling. This quiet, heavy truth that something in me had been asleep for a long time. And now, it was waking up. I didn't know what I was doing. Not really. I just needed something to hold. Something real. Each morning started with the same quiet routine. Coffee, job boards, another 5 rejections, maybe 6. Some didn't even bother replying anymore. It was the kind of silence that echoed. But every evening, after Emma went to bed and the dishes were done, I'd go out to the garage. It smelled like dust and motor oil. Old wood curled in the corners, like it had been waiting for me. I found a box marked Jason's Projects, tucked behind a lawnmower that hadn't started since 2014. Inside, a mess of wood shavings, a cracked leveler, and a photo of me younger, holding a half-finished rocking chair with a stupid grin. I remembered sanding that chair after we found out we were having Tyler. I was going to build him a set, crib, high chair, maybe even a little bookshelf. But then overtime kicked in, deadlines piled up, and I shelved the whole thing, telling myself I'd finish it one day. That chair never got its legs. Now, in that same garage I started again. I didn't have a plan. I just cut and joined and sanded. At first it was random. Boxes, frames, even a warped cutting board that cracked in 2. I wasn't building anything useful. But it didn't matter. For a few hours a night, I wasn't some discarded manager with a templated, "We regret to inform you," hanging over my head. I was just a guy with a hammer and something to shape. One night, Emma came out and stood at the doorway, arms folded in that way she did when she wasn't sure if she should say something. "Do you know what you're making yet?" she asked, almost amused. I shook my head. Not yet. Just needed to remember I could still make something. She didn't say much after that. Just stood there for a while before quietly going back inside. Some days, I'd sketch things in an old notebook, things I never had time for. A folding desk design I dreamed up 10 years ago. A modular shelf. A wooden puzzle I thought Tyler might have liked as a kid. None of it felt urgent. But it felt mine. And slowly, something in me started shifting. It wasn't that I'd given up on finding work. I still checked listings, sent resumes. But the desperation began to fade. Or maybe I just stopped waiting for someone else to hand me permission to feel useful. I think that's what the workshop gave me. Permission. To fail. To create. To keep going even when no one clapped. One day I found an old drawer full of receipts and scribbled measurements. At the bottom was a sketch of a wall-mounted fold-out desk. My handwriting was shaky, the angles off, but the idea was solid. I pinned it to the corkboard above the bench. Started adjusting dimensions. Buying cheap lumber with the last of a hardware store gift card. Nights turned into real plans. Cuts turned into clean joints. Then one afternoon, Emma brought me lemonade, something she hadn't done since the early years. She watched me work from the corner, eyes following the lines I traced across the panel. "You look different in here," she said quietly. I looked up. Different how? Like, you're not waiting for the world to tell you who you are. I didn't know what to say to that. But it stuck. That night I sat in the garage alone, holding the nearly finished desk. It wasn't perfect. One hinge leaned too far left. The surface was slightly uneven. But it was real. It came from my hands, from nothing. I didn't cry, not exactly. But I let my breath out in a way I hadn't in weeks. Like I'd been holding it since the moment I packed up my office in that damn cardboard box. The next morning, I took a picture of the desk and uploaded it to a small woodworking forum I used to lurk on. I titled it, "First Project in a Long Time. Be Gentle." 3 hours later, someone replied, "This is beautiful. Do you sell plans?" I stared at that comment for a long time. No, I didn't sell plans. I wasn't a business. I wasn't even sure if I could make it again without messing up. But I replied, not yet. But I could. It wasn't a resume. It wasn't a salary. But it was a door. A quiet one. Covered in dust and doubt and hesitation. Still, it opened. And for the first time in weeks, I felt something click. Not in wood, but in me. It started with a name I hadn't heard in months. Carl Monroe. He was a vendor I'd worked with for years. Just a simple voicemail at first. He wanted a copy of an old distribution map we'd drawn up for a regional launch. Said he'd called the company line and was surprised when Derek's assistant told him I was no longer with the team. There was a pause in his voice, like he wasn't sure how to process that. I called him back the same day, told him I had a PDF in my archives and could send it over. But instead, he asked if I'd be open to grabbing coffee. Said he just wanted to catch up. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe he just wanted to see the look on my face when he brought up the news. I didn't blame him. We met at a small cafe near the old industrial park where we'd once sketched supply routes on the back of napkins. Carl had aged a bit. Grayer, slower in speech, but still sharp. Still observant. So what happened? He asked after some pleasantries. I could have ranted. I could have unloaded the full timeline. How Derek had blindsided me, how HR had gone quiet, how the same execs I'd trained pretended not to recognize my name 2 days later. But I didn't. I just said, there was a shift. Priorities changed. Carl nodded slowly, like he understood more than I was willing to say. Then he leaned forward. Can I be honest with you, Jason? The place hasn't been the same. That surprised me. Deliveries are late. Pricing's inconsistent. The last quote I got for warehouse integration looked like a high school project. I thought maybe you were on leave or working remote. But it feels like someone ripped the spine out of the place. I didn't know what to say to that. I'd left quietly. No farewell email. No LinkedIn announcement. Just a final keycard swipe and the echo of hollow goodbyes. I hadn't thought anyone would notice. A week later I got another call. This time from Nadine, the freight manager at a firm we'd partnered with during the expansion phase in Texas. She said she'd heard I was doing consulting now. I wasn't. Not officially. But I met her for lunch anyway. She brought a tablet and laid out a list of issues, bottlenecks, labor confusion, inefficient routing, and asked how I would have approached it. I didn't sell myself. I just listened, made a few suggestions, and left it at that. But by the time I got home, there was an email from her CFO asking for a formal proposal. That's how it began. Quietly. Without fanfare. They didn't come out of loyalty. They came because something wasn't working, and they remembered that when things did work, I was there. Not in front of the cameras or on stage at the annual meetings, but behind the scenes. Making sure trucks didn't sit idle. That invoices didn't get lost in approval purgatory. That new warehouse crews got trained before rollout, not after. What Derek never understood, what he probably still doesn't, is that I didn't manage logistics. I built relationships. I remembered birthdays. I called to check on warehouse managers after surgeries. I took calls at 2 a.m. when shipments stalled at border checkpoints. I didn't do it for applause. I did it because I knew every link in that chain had a name, a face, and a life outside of purchase orders. By month's end, 5 more companies had reached out. Some needed help restructuring their flow. Others just wanted me to train their junior leads. You're like the guy behind the curtain, Carl joked one day on a follow-up call. Turns out the curtain mattered more than we thought. It made me laugh, but it stuck with me. Because for so long, I thought I had been replaceable. I believed Derek when he said, "You were just a gear in the machine." But the machine was breaking, and now, people were trying to find the gear that used to keep it running. I didn't rush to form an LLC. I didn't print business cards or launch a website. That wasn't the point. This wasn't about reinvention, it was about quiet restoration. I wasn't chasing something new. I was slowly, steadily reclaiming the pieces of myself that corporate erosion had stripped away. Some evenings, I'd stare at the whiteboard in my home office. Once blank, now cluttered with diagrams, timelines, initials. It wasn't pride I felt. It was something quieter. Calmer. Validation. Not from praise, but from need. A few clients asked if I'd ever go back. If I'd consider taking another permanent role. I'd smile, say I wasn't sure yet. But the truth? I didn't want to sit in someone else's office again, waiting for their approval to do what I already knew how to do. One night, I got a message on LinkedIn. It was from an intern I'd mentored 3 years ago. "Hey Jason. I heard what happened. Just wanted to say, you taught me more in 6 months than my MBA ever did. Hope you're doing okay." I stared at it for a long time. I wasn't just doing okay. I was rebuilding from the ground up, quietly, like the way trust grows back after a fracture. And for the first time in months, I didn't feel like something was over. I felt like something was beginning. I didn't post about it. No announcement. No mission statement. Just a Gmail address, a spreadsheet, and a quiet shift in how I answered the phone. "Jason speaking," I'd say, and wait to see what they needed. There was no launch party. No shiny logo. I didn't call it a company. At first it was just me, helping. Then it became something more. Slowly. Naturally. I started with 3 clients. People I trusted. People who had called not because I was available, but because they remembered how things used to work when I was involved. One by one they asked, "Can you just take a look? Or would you mind advising the new guy?" I said yes, not because I had a plan, but because I didn't want to disappear. 6 months later, I had more work than I could take. It didn't feel like success. Not at first. It felt like pacing. Like stitching a quiet rhythm back into days that had once collapsed into silence. I rented a small shared office above a hardware store. No receptionist. No glass doors. Just a desk, a printer, and a corkboard where I kept scribbled notes on clients and routes. Every now and then, someone would ask what pushed me to start my own thing. I'd shrug and say, I just needed to work with people who valued getting it right. I never mentioned Derek. I didn't have to. The stories started trickling in through back channels. Delayed shipments. Lost contracts. Vendors walking away after late payments and confused leadership. A warehouse expansion halted halfway because someone forgot to file the right permits. Someone texted me a photo once. Derek standing at a loading dock, sleeves rolled up, yelling into a walkie-talkie. The caption just said, "Captain of the ship." I didn't laugh. I didn't even feel satisfied. But I did feel something else. Clarity. They hadn't let me go because I was unneeded. They let me go because they didn't understand what I did. They looked at the spreadsheets, the chain of command, the polished meetings, and thought that was the job. It wasn't. The job was knowing that when a driver called me at 3 a.m. from a snowed-in road outside Des Moines, I'd answer. That when Nadine asked me to review a customs form on a holiday weekend, I'd already sent it back with notes. That trust wasn't part of the system. It was the system. And Derek, for all his talk about disrupting the model, never built that trust. I remember having lunch with Carl again during that stretch. He watched me carefully as I pulled out my notebook, ready to dive into their new freight model. "You seem different," he said. "Different how?" I asked. He thought for a moment. "Like you stopped waiting to be given something." That landed deeper than he probably meant it to. Because for 20 years, I'd waited. For promotions, recognition, direction. I waited for someone to say, "Now you matter." And when they didn't, I just worked harder, thinking maybe they'd notice next time. But now, there was no one to wait for. Just clients who needed things done, and my own sense of what was worth doing. There were quiet wins. A regional partner who'd left my old company called to say, "We'd rather deal with you directly." A mid-sized distributor signed a 6-month retainer after I helped them cut costs by 18%. One night, my son walked into the garage while I was sketching out a supply chain diagram on a whiteboard I'd bolted to the wall. He looked at it, curious. "Is this your job now?" he asked. "Kind of," I said. "I guess I just help people keep things moving." He pointed at a box labeled delays. "So you fix stuff that gets stuck?" I smiled. "Yeah, that's a big part of it." He nodded, satisfied, then wandered off. I stood there for a moment, looking at that word, delays. That's what they tried to make of me. A delay. An outdated part of the machine. A name on a severance list. But now I knew better. They couldn't take my work ethic. They couldn't erase the connections I'd built. They couldn't write me out of people's memories. They just hoped I'd stay quiet. And I had. Not out of shame, but because I was busy building something stronger. Something they couldn't dismantle. I never wished failure on them. But failure came anyway. Because when you rip out the roots, the tree doesn't grow. It tilts, it withers, and eventually, it falls. I didn't celebrate that. But I did sit with it. In silence. With dignity. It had been 11 months and 2 days since I packed my things into a cardboard box and walked out of that building. By the time the call came, I wasn't angry anymore. Not bitter. Just elsewhere. I was reviewing a shipment schedule when my phone rang. Unknown number. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something made me pick up. "Jason," a voice said. "It's Harold Cartwright." I didn't say anything at first. The name hit differently than it used to. Years ago, he was the founder, the steady presence behind the walls. But now, his voice sounded older, thinner. "I'm calling," he continued, "because I think we need to talk." I leaned back in my chair, the pen in my hand stilled. "About what?" There was a pause. Just enough silence to let truth slip through. "The company's not in good shape," he said quietly. "Derek. Well, he's stepped down." I didn't react. I already knew. Word travels faster than regret. "I see. We made some mistakes, Jason," he added. "And I think we both know one of them was letting you go." That part landed with a strange calm. Not relief, not validation. Just something settled. "We'd like you to come in," he said. "No pressure. Just to talk." I stayed quiet. "We're willing to offer. Well, just name it. Whatever you need to come back." That's when I knew. They hadn't called because they saw my worth. They called because they needed rescue. I looked at the whiteboard on my wall. Notes from 5 different clients. Deadlines circled. Problems solved. Work that mattered. "Harold," I said, "I appreciate the call. Really. But I'm not coming back." He exhaled softly. "Is it money?" "It's not about money," I said. "It's about trust. About how easily it was broken." He was quiet. Then finally, "You were the backbone. We see that now." "Now," I repeated. Another silence. "If you ever change your mind." "I won't," I said. "But I wish you well." We ended the call politely, cordially. No slammed doors. No burned bridges. Just the kind of ending that happens when you've already walked away, long before they noticed you were gone. Afterward, I stood by the window. Same view. Same street. The world unchanged. But I wasn't. There was a time I would have raced back. Negotiated. Compromised. Tried to prove I was worth keeping. But not anymore. Because in the months after losing that job, I'd rebuilt something from nothing. Not just a business. Not just income. But a life on my terms. No one could fire me now. No one could take away the nights I spent sketching new systems, or the clients who stuck by me not because they had to, but because they wanted to. I thought about Derek. The way he used to talk over people in meetings. His obsession with numbers and optics. I imagined his face when things started slipping, when the machine he thought he could control began falling apart without the parts he never valued. But I didn't feel triumph. Only distance. The kind that grows when you stop needing approval and start trusting yourself. That night, I told my wife about the call. She raised an eyebrow. You going back? No, I said. I already did the hard part. Leaving. She nodded. I'm proud of you. I smiled. Not because I needed to hear it, but because I believed it too. Later, I went out to the garage. My son's old drawing was still pinned to the wall, a stick figure version of me next to a tiny building labeled Dad's Company. I used to think success was something other people handed you. Promotions, titles, offers. Now I knew better. Success wasn't loud. It didn't come with applause or LinkedIn posts. Sometimes, it was a quiet decision to say no to what once broke you. Sometimes, it was just a phone call you didn't answer with hope, but with clarity. They had built a company that couldn't hold without the people who held it up. And I had built something they couldn't replace. That call came too late. But I was right on time.